Every day, we see the darker side of the world around us. We witness how people can hurt others in ways that are hard to understand. It's a sad part of life, but it's something we can't ignore. As someone who dives into the world of crime, I'm here to share the most shocking stories and try to understand what drives people to do such things. I'm Michael, and today, I've got another unreal true crime story for you. It was just another quiet morning in Graham, Pennsylvania, until the gunshots rang out. Inside a cozy home near the woods, a man collapsed to the floor, struggling to take his last breath. A few seconds later, his wife rushed out of the bedroom, confused and terrified by the noise. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. A figure stood in the living room, holding a gun. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then, more shots. By the time the sun came up, the house was completely still. Nothing was stolen. There was no sign of a break-in, just two bodies lying side by side, covered with a blanket, almost like someone wanted to hide what had happened. Who could have done this? And why? As detectives began digging into the case, they uncovered a disturbing story, one that no one in this quiet town was prepared for. Brian and Beverly's story started on a warm spring evening in 2001 when they met at a mutual friend's party. Both were college students at the time, and from the moment their eyes met, there was an undeniable connection. What began as friendly curiosity quickly turned into a deep bond, and before long, they were inseparable. That summer, their relationship grew stronger as they introduced each other to their families. Both sides welcomed their new partner with open arms, instantly recognizing how well Brian and Beverly complemented one another. Their shared love for adventure and excitement made them a perfect match. Beverly had always been an energetic and talented athlete, excelling in baseball and track. Beyond sports, she played the guitar effortlessly and had a gift for learning new languages. Her warm personality and bright smile made her a favorite among friends and peers. Brian, on the other hand, had a taste for thrill and risk. He was drawn to extreme sports like rock climbing, surfing, and scuba diving, always looking for the next challenge. He had a deep appreciation for adventure, never letting fear hold him back. Despite their strong bond, they weren't in a rush to marry. Both were committed to finishing their studies first. After graduating, they focused on building a future together, saving up to buy their own home. Brian started working in an industrial company, while Beverly pursued a career in hotel administration, where her language skills proved invaluable. On May 15, 2006, they finally exchanged vows in a breathtaking seaside ceremony, surrounded by close family and friends. Their honeymoon was an adventure of its own, taking them to several countries before they returned home to start the next chapter of their lives. They settled in the quiet town of Graham, Pennsylvania, purchasing a beautiful house near a river and a dense forest. It was the ideal place to lay down roots. Brian continued his work as an engineer, and Beverly shifted her focus to translation work while also pursuing further studies. They quickly became part of the local community, making friends and embracing their peaceful new life. But their happiness was short-lived. On the morning of November 17, 2007, Brian's longtime friend Stephen arrived at their home as planned. He and Brian had arranged a fishing trip, but when he knocked on the door, no one answered. At first, He assumed his friend had overslept. He knocked again, louder this time, but the silence from inside the house made him uneasy. Thinking Brian might have simply forgotten, Stephen waited in his car for about half an hour, trying to call multiple times. Still, there was no response. Frustrated but not yet alarmed, he eventually decided to go fishing alone. As the day passed with no word from Brian or Beverly, Stephen's unease grew. That evening, he returned to their house, knocking once more. The silence was unsettling. This time he decided to take a closer look. Circling the property, he peered through the windows, but the house was dark. Something didn't feel right. When he reached the garage, he noticed that Brian and Beverly's car was parked inside. That made no sense. If they were home, why weren't they answering? Walking to the living room window, he pressed his face to the glass, straining to see inside. The dim light outside made visibility difficult, but something on the floor caught his attention. The television was overturned, and next to it was a large, unmoving shape. Stephen's pulse quickened. He rushed to his car, grabbed his flashlight, and directed the beam through the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Lying motionless on the floor were two bodies, partially covered by a blood-soaked blanket. A bare foot was visible on one side, a lifeless hand on the other. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone and dialed 911. His voice shook as he reported what he had seen, urging authorities to come immediately. He remained outside the house, waiting, unable to tear his eyes away from the tragic scene. When officers arrived, Stephen was the first person they questioned. He explained everything: the planned fishing trip, the unanswered calls, and the horrifying discovery. He couldn't shake the feeling of regret, wishing he had checked the windows earlier. Inside, the scene was grim. The front door wasn't locked, nor did it show any signs of forced entry. That alone raised suspicions. In the living room, Brian and Beverly's lifeless bodies were found just as Stephen had seen them. Preliminary findings suggested they had been dead for at least 12 hours. Each had sustained 3 gunshot wounds from a large-caliber weapon. The precision of the shots indicated that the attacker was deliberate, possibly even experienced. But why? There was no evidence of a robbery. Nothing was missing. Their wallets, phones, and cash remained untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had tried to fight back. It was as if whoever had done this had come with one goal in mind: execution. One disturbing detail stood out. The bodies had been moved after the murders. Blood smeared across the floor revealed drag marks, and the perpetrator had made a clumsy attempt at cleaning up. Smudged streaks of blood marred the walls and furniture, mapping out the brutal sequence of events. Despite the effort to erase evidence, forensic specialists could still follow the trail. 6 spent shell casings lay at the scene, carelessly abandoned. The evidence suggested that a single assailant had fired every shot, and likely, there was only one person responsible for the crime. The lack of forced entry raised another troubling question. The door had been unlocked, suggesting that Brian and Beverly had willingly allowed their killer inside. Investigators theorized that Brian had answered a knock at the door and recognized the visitor. Perhaps he had turned to lead them into the house when, without warning, 3 bullets struck him in the back. One of the rounds passed through his body, shattering the television screen and sending it crashing to the floor. The sound must have drawn Beverly from the bedroom. She likely froze in horror at the sight of her husband's lifeless body and the armed intruder standing over him. She ran, but didn't make it far. 3 bullets struck her from behind, cutting her down in the hallway. Her body was later dragged to the living room, placed beside Brian's. Both were still wearing their pajamas, suggesting they had been attacked in the early morning hours, before they had even begun their day. One perplexing detail remained. The killer had covered the bodies with a blanket. Was it an act of remorse? An attempt to conceal the brutality of the crime? No one could say for sure. The floor was smeared with blood, as if someone had tried to clean it, but only made the mess worse. A large stain near the bodies had been partially disturbed, as if someone had attempted to scrub it away. Behind the couch, officers discovered a plastic broom with dried blood clinging to its bristles. The handle, however, had been meticulously wiped clean of fingerprints. This suggested the killer had used it to sweep away bloody footprints, but had taken care to erase any trace of their own identity. Smudged handprints and palm prints dotted the walls, doors, and furniture, too distorted to yield a clear match. Despite the killer's effort to obscure their presence, forensic experts knew one thing. The longer someone stayed at a crime scene, the greater the likelihood of leaving behind an incriminating clue. And then, they found it. On the blanket covering Brian and Beverly's bodies, there was a faint but crucial detail: a boot print. It wasn't a blood stain, but rather an impression left on an area where only a light layer of blood had settled. The pattern was distinctive. Forensic analysis determined that it came from a rare model of heavy-duty work boots. Investigators traced the boots to a construction company in Clearfield County that had recently purchased several pairs. With this lead, they narrowed their focus to employees who had access to them. Another potential breakthrough came when detectives found a palm print on one of the house's surfaces. It was carefully analyzed and run through law enforcement databases. No match. The perpetrator had no criminal record and had never been fingerprinted. That meant they weren't in any known offender registries, making the identification process far more difficult. Naturally, the first person under suspicion was Stephen, the friend who had discovered the bodies. He had visited the house twice that day and had been the one to alert authorities. His involvement in the timeline raised some eyebrows. When detectives questioned him, Stephen was visibly shaken. He explained that he had assumed Brian and Beverly were still asleep when they hadn't answered the door that morning. It wasn't until later in the day, when he still couldn't reach them, that he returned and decided to investigate. Once he realized he was being treated as a suspect, Stephen was shocked. He claimed he had spent the entire day fishing at a secluded spot by the river, but since no one had been there with him, he had no alibi. Investigators, however, had tools at their disposal. They reviewed footage from traffic cameras along the roads leading to and from the fishing area. The recordings confirmed Stephen's timeline. He had indeed been exactly where he said he was. Further forensic testing cleared him as well. His fingerprints didn't match any of those found at the scene, and tests for gunshot residue on his hands and clothing came back negative. Additionally, the boot print at the crime scene didn't match his shoe size, and he had no connection to the construction company that had purchased the boots. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime, Stephen was officially ruled out. Hoping for another lead, detectives canvassed the neighborhood. When they knocked on the door of Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, who lived across the street from Brian and Beverly, they finally got something useful. Daniel answered and explained that his wife, Jennifer, was at work, but he was happy to speak with them. He recalled that on the morning of the murders, around 5:30 a.m., he had heard loud noises coming from the couple's home. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, he realized they had sounded like gunshots. Curious but wary, Daniel had glanced out the window and noticed a white pickup truck parked near Brian and Beverly's house. He was sure the vehicle didn't belong to them. Moments later, he saw two men exit the house. Due to the dim pre-dawn light, he couldn't get a good look at them. However, he did manage to note key details about the driver of the truck. The man was white, around 40 years old with a solid build. He had long dark hair pulled back into a ponytail and a mustache. Daniel also noticed that the man had a tattoo on his left hand, though he couldn't make out the design. Despite this promising lead, no one else in the neighborhood had seen the truck or its occupants. During an interview with detectives, Beverly's mother recalled a troubling conversation she had with her daughter just months before the tragedy. Beverly had mentioned a neighbor, Jeremy Flint, who had made her feel uneasy. Jeremy, a 22-year-old man, had a reputation that had already drawn law enforcement's attention. Known for dealing illegal substances, his home was a frequent stop for questionable visitors, and other neighbors had voiced their concerns about his presence in the community. Given his history, investigators considered him a person of interest. When officers went to Jeremy's home, they found it empty. Their immediate thought was that he had fled after committing the crime. However, speaking with local residents revealed another potential motive. Shortly before the murders, Brian and Beverly had hosted a small gathering at their house. Jeremy, uninvited and heavily intoxicated, had barged in. Witnesses recalled his erratic and aggressive behavior, harassing women, insulting guests, and stirring up conflict. After a heated exchange, he was forced to leave. But before storming off, he made a chilling threat. The couple would regret humiliating him. The next morning, Brian and Beverly discovered that several items were missing from their home, including a cell phone and a handgun with ammunition that had been stored in a pantry drawer. Convinced Jeremy was behind the theft, they confronted him at his house. Though they remained calm, they made it clear that if their belongings weren't returned, they would report him to the authorities. Jeremy denied taking anything and refused to hand over the stolen items. But the following day, the missing belongings mysteriously reappeared in the couple's backyard. Though they had no proof, Brian and Beverly were certain that Jeremy had sneaked onto their property at night to return them. While the situation seemed resolved, Beverly couldn't shake her unease. She began to fear being home alone and urged Brian to consider moving to a different neighborhood. Jeremy finally resurfaced several days after the murders. Detectives immediately brought him in for questioning, but their suspicions quickly began to fade. As it turned out, Jeremy had been out of town when the crime took place. He had traveled to another state to visit his parents and stayed with them for nearly a week, only returning the day after the killings. His alibi was airtight, confirmed by multiple witnesses, which placed him miles away on the night of the murders. Further forensic analysis sealed his innocence. His fingerprints and palm prints didn't match any found at the crime scene, and he had no connection to the distinctive work boots investigators had linked to the case. With no evidence tying him to the crime, Jeremy was eliminated as a suspect. With their strongest lead gone, investigators found themselves back at square one. Desperate for a breakthrough, they revisited the only witness who had provided useful information, Daniel Tavares. Daniel had initially reported seeing a suspicious white pickup truck near Brian and Beverly's home around the time of the crime. But when detectives spoke to him again, his story had changed. Suddenly, Daniel claimed he could now recall details about what the perpetrators were wearing. He even described one of the men, saying he had a scar on his cheek. This contradicted his original statement, where he had insisted that the men's faces were obscured by hoodies. Sensing something was off, detectives asked Daniel to show them the window he had looked through that morning. When they examined the view, they noticed that even in broad daylight, it was difficult to make out clear details of anything across the street. Considering that the murders had occurred before dawn, it seemed impossible that Daniel could have seen so much. His shifting story raised a chilling possibility. Had Daniel been lying all along? And if so, why? A deeper look into Daniel's background revealed a disturbing history. Born in 1966 into a strict military family, Daniel's early years were marked by hardship. When he was 4 years old, his parents divorced, leaving him and his three older sisters in the care of their mother. His father quickly remarried and distanced himself from his children, showing little interest in their upbringing. By the time Daniel reached ninth grade, his life had spiraled out of control. He dropped out of school, frequently ran away from home, and became involved in petty theft. At 18, he was arrested for robbery for the first time. Remarkably, his estranged father intervened, helping him avoid jail time by securing a probation sentence. Perhaps motivated by guilt, he wanted to give his son another chance. But Daniel squandered it. Over the years, he continued his descent into crime, repeatedly being arrested for theft and drug-related offenses. Each time, he received light sentences. In the late 1980s, Daniel's father made one last attempt to set him on the right path. He brought his son to Florida, paid for an expensive rehabilitation program, and even helped him find a stable job. It didn't last. Within 6 months, Daniel was caught stealing again. This time, his father gave up on him completely and sent him back to live with his mother. By then, Daniel's mental state had deteriorated significantly. He was soon diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed medication. However, he rarely took it as directed. Instead, he mixed it with alcohol, leading to violent and unpredictable behavior. In July 1991, a heated argument with his mother escalated into something unimaginable. In a sudden, frenzied attack, Daniel grabbed a knife and stabbed her nearly 30 times. She died before help could arrive. At his trial, he claimed he had been hearing voices, an argument that could have led to an insanity defense. However, psychiatric evaluations determined that Daniel had been fully aware of his actions. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite being sentenced to 20 years, Daniel was released on parole in 2006, serving significantly less time than expected. While incarcerated, he had begun exchanging letters with Jennifer. Over time, their correspondence developed into a romantic relationship. Jennifer remained devoted to him, waiting patiently for his release. As soon as he was paroled, the two married, and Daniel moved into her home in Graham, a small, quiet town. However, in moving states, Daniel had violated the terms of his parole. He should have been arrested immediately, but a mix of bureaucratic failures and police negligence allowed him to slip through the system unnoticed. A clerical error resulted in his fingerprints being erased from law enforcement databases, effectively making him invisible to authorities. This mistake would prove crucial. Even after investigators found a bloody handprint at the Mox crime scene, there was no immediate match in any records. Further digging revealed another troubling detail. Daniel had briefly worked for the construction company that had purchased the rare work boots linked to the murder. Despite this, detectives lacked direct evidence to arrest him. They needed a solid case before making their move. On November 24, 2007, detectives invited Daniel to the police station under the pretense of helping create composite sketches of potential suspects. Eager to cooperate, he agreed, spending nearly an hour assisting in the creation of completely fabricated portraits. As he focused on the sketches, an officer casually entered the room and mentioned that they needed to take Daniel's fingerprints just to rule him out. For the first time, Daniel hesitated, but after a brief pause, he relented, certain that there was no way his prints could still be tied to the crime scene. Moments later, another officer offhandedly mentioned a key discovery, the bloody handprint found inside the Mox home. Daniel tensed. His expression shifted as he nervously explained that he had visited the Mox home in the past, meaning his fingerprints could be there. The officer reassured him that there was no reason to worry. After all, The handprint was in blood, meaning it had been left by the killer. At that moment, a second detective steered the conversation toward Daniel's past, bringing up the crime for which he had been imprisoned. When asked, Daniel admitted to killing his mother. But what happened next stunned investigators. Instead of expressing remorse, Daniel recounted the murder in chilling detail. He smiled as he described the attack, showing an eerie detachment. His tone was almost boastful, like someone reliving a proud accomplishment. While he rambled, forensic analysts completed their work. The bloody handprint from the crime scene was an exact match to Daniel Tabares. Detectives confronted him with the evidence. The smugness vanished from his face in an instant. His hands clenched into fists, his eyes dark with rage. But before he could react, officers restrained him and placed him under arrest. Faced with undeniable proof, Daniel knew he had no way out. He finally admitted to what had happened that morning. The previous night, he had spent hours at a bar, drinking heavily and using drugs. By the time he had run out of money, he was belligerent and aggressive. The bar staff threw him out, threatening to call the police if he caused further trouble. Furious and humiliated, Daniel fixated on an absurd thought. Brian owed him money. A month earlier, Daniel had given Brian a tattoo as a friendly favor. But now, in his intoxicated state, he convinced himself that Brian had taken advantage of him. He decided he was owed $50 for the work and that he would collect it no matter what. At 5 a.m., still seething, Daniel grabbed his revolver and walked over to the Mock's house. When Brian answered the door, he was groggy and irritated at being woken so early. Daniel immediately demanded payment for the tattoo. Confused, Brian refused, telling Daniel to come back when he was sober. Daniel insisted. Not wanting to argue, Brian sighed and turned toward the bedroom to grab some cash, hoping it would make Daniel leave. But as he walked away, he made an offhanded remark, one that Daniel perceived as an insult. Enraged, Daniel pulled out his gun and shot Brian 3 times in the back. The gunfire woke Beverly, who rushed out of the bedroom to find her husband lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. She froze, locking eyes with Daniel, who still held the smoking revolver. Realizing the danger, she turned to flee, but she only made it a few steps before 3 bullets struck her from behind. Once the horrific act was done, Daniel panicked. He ran home, waking his wife, Jennifer, but instead of reacting with shock or horror, Jennifer barely flinched. Without hesitation, she agreed to help him cover up the crime. Together they returned to the Mock's house. Jennifer helped move Beverly's body into the living room, placing her beside Brian. She then grabbed a blanket and covered them both. She was also the one who suggested using a broom to erase the bloody footprints. She meticulously wiped down every surface, ensuring that no obvious prints were left behind. But she missed one. When the cleanup was done, Daniel disposed of the murder weapon, throwing it into a nearby river. Despite extensive searches, the gun was never recovered. With his confession and forensic evidence stacked against him, Daniel had no hope of freedom. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jennifer, claiming she had only helped out of fear, cooperated fully with investigators. She was sentenced to 1 year in prison for tampering with evidence. The case seemed closed. But Daniel Tabares's dark history was far from over. Years later, in 2015, the past resurfaced in a horrifying way. New homeowners had purchased the house where Daniel had once lived with his mother. During renovations, they began digging up the backyard. Buried deep in the soil, they unearthed human remains. Forensic analysis confirmed what detectives had feared. The bones belonged to a young woman who had gone missing in 1990. As investigators pieced the story together, a disturbing truth emerged. Daniel had known the woman. She had been a neighbor. He had been interested in her, but when she rejected his advances, he reacted with lethal violence. Rather than risk getting caught, he had buried her in his mother's backyard, where her body remained hidden for decades. The new evidence led to Daniel receiving a second life sentence. It was now clear Daniel Taber's had always been a predator, lurking in the shadows, and for years he had managed to escape justice, until, at last, the truth caught up with him. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.